Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Monica Guzman. I will tell you all about her in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that focuses on what we call the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment that we do to bring people together. And when you do it as a leader, as you will very much discover that Monica is, you do it with a single cause to bring people together for reasons of greater understanding. Welcome, Monica Guzman.
Hey,
great.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'd like to tell everybody about you. Monica Guzman is a bridge builder. I love that term, and she lives it. She's a journalist as well as an entrepreneur. She's the director of digital and storytelling at Braver Angels, the nation's largest cross-partisan grassroots organization working to depolarize America. Boy, do you think we need that? So she has a distinguished background. She is a fellow at the Henry M. Jackson Foundation, named for her once upon a time senator from her home state of Washington. She was also a Nieman Fellow for Journalism at Harvard. And folks, that's really cool. So anyway, she was named one of the most 50 influential women in Seattle and served as a juror twice for the Pulitzer Prize. We welcome her to our show, and we're going to talk about her brand new book. And Monica, tell me, I never thought of it that way. What a wonderful title. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Great. So what led you to write a book? I mean, do you think we disagree with one another?
Oh, a little bit. Disagreement is not the problem. Disagreement is natural and good. The problem is that we have become so divided that we're blinded. We're blinded to who each other really is and what people's perspectives truly are. And this is because the divisions in our society have become so embedded in our behaviors and in our environment that I call it the SOS, the call for help. We're sorting into groups of like-minded people. We are othering those who are too different from us and putting a lot of distance between us. And then we are siloing ourselves, of course, into the communities and groups of people who make us comfortable in a really anxious time. What that means is that we're really skewing our view of people who disagree with us. And that level of fear and suspicion and distrust, that's the problem.
Great. Well, thank you. Now, you are a journalist, but you are also a very eloquent writer. And the opening of your book, I Never Thought of It That Way, tells the story of you going to visit your parents close to the election day of 2016. But then you also pick up some anecdotes from people of different political persuasions. And unfortunately, sadly, the human toll that this polarity is causing. Tell us about that, Monica.
Yeah, so through my frankly just deep interest, almost obsession with the political divide over several years, born a bit from my relationship with my parents. We're politically divided ourselves. I'm liberal, they're conservative. They voted for Trump. I voted for Clinton and Biden, and it's made for some really interesting conversations over the years. But thanks to that, and now my work at Braver Angels, which is the largest cross-partisan nonprofit working to bring people together across the divide to depolarize America, my email inbox has become something of a confession booth, a place where people, people have so much pain across this divide. It's breaking relationships. It's not really just about politics. It's getting people to a pretty painful place.
Right. And when you say breaking relationships, we're talking, I think you have one example of a father and son estrangement, that kind of thing. That's awful. That's just awful. So you use a term, and I love this because it echoes someone that I admire greatly, and that's Father Greg Boyle, who created Homeboy Industries in East LA. It's the largest gang intervention program. And he wrote a book with called Barking at the Choir, and the subtitle was Radical Kinship. You talk about radical curiosity. What does radical curiosity mean, Monica?
So radical curiosity is curiosity right at those places that make us most uncomfortable, right at those places that we not sure that we want to be curious. In fact, we're pretty sure we know everything we need to know about those other people and what they think, wherever we happen to be on politics or social issues. And that's the place that a lot of Americans find themselves today. We've seen the social science research that shows just how divided people believe they are. But then when you actually look at ideological perspectives, we're not that divided. It's more about the animosity we feel toward people on the other side.
Right. You said something that I actually surprises me, but it's how does human nature mitigate our sense of curiosity? I would have thought just the opposite, but enlighten me, please. So,
Right. So it's a double-edged sword. I was talking about the SOS before, the
mhm,
sorting, othering, and siloing. Those are three dynamics of human nature that go all the way back. It's just part of how society has evolved. It
mhm.
gives us a lot of meaning to be around people who are just like ourselves, especially in times of, again, great stress and anxiety, like everything
It,
that society's been going through.
be honest, it's comfortable.
Well,
So,
exactly. And yeah, who wants more discomfort at a time like
yeah.
this? You know what I mean? We're already pretty darn but at the same time, we really are wired to see each other and connect with each other in
Yes.
incredible ways. When you just sit and consider the enormous sophistication that goes into the skill of just having a conversation, it's remarkable that all of us have this skill. We don't even have to think about it, but these micro decisions happen all the time. The tone, the gestures, what to talk about. It's wild that we can do that. And so we are wired to connect. We're wired to share because we need to in order to thrive and survive and to build the societies that we have. We need to be able to see across difference.
No, that's one of the things that we're wrestling with the virtual and or hybrid or full time work. It's we're not wired for the video screen,
Mm.
but yet many of us can work very comfortably that way. But how do we come together? How do we create community? Well, here's the $64,000 question.
Mhm.
So let's say I try to reach out to someone who holds different opinions, whatever, and so and we just can't come to an agreement. Is it worth trying or should
Mhm.
we move on? What do you say to that,
Mhm.
Monica?
Well, it certainly depends on the context. So, if you are looking for making sure that a relationship is in a good place despite disagreement, if you are, in a workplace context and want to work together on a project, pretty much no matter what, if you need to continue to kind of contend with each other, and of course, citizens and locals and residents of the country, we need to continue to contend with each other across disagreements, then you can really switch your question. You can switch your question from who wins to what makes each view understandable. And one of the great ways to do that is if you just lean away from persuasion and trying to win, you can say instead, all right, how did you come to believe what you believe? What concerns animate your beliefs? Tell me what you're worried about. Tell me what you hope for. And you switch your mind from this place where you are trying to get an edge to where you're trying to learn and understand. And in every case, especially again, when in a workplace context where there's disagreement, you have to contend with different perspectives. You're going to find a better place from which to collaborate. You're going to find a place where you are more creative. And in the case of our political divides, you're going to also probably reduce the fear and suspicion that you have about what people are supposed to be based on the signals you've heard in the media by actually talking to real people and realizing that maybe you have more in common than you think.
And that's great. And I like what you dovetail persuasion, and it's not win. And when I seek to win you over, then I'm really fighting probably a losing a ball, or at least a short game. It echoes something that Adam Grant wrote in his wonderful new book called Think Again, and he tells a story about a physician in Montreal, works in a hospital, and he's a pediatrician. And so occasionally he deals with with parents who do not want their children vaccinated. They call him the vaccine whisperer
Mm.
and what he does is he sits down with usually the mom, and just said, "Tell me about it." So
Mm.
the first thing he does, and I would think you would say, "Listen."
Yeah.
Would you agree with that, Monica?
Absolutely. The deep down principle is that people don't hear unless they're heard. And it's very difficult to tell visibly if somebody feels heard. And so if you begin by saying, okay, put it on the table, what you got, what's in you that's coming up. And if
Mhm.
you if you have conversations where everyone who's engaged in that gets a turn and a chance to really be heard, and that means that you're not just waiting your turn. That means that you're actually aiming your curiosity at them. So they're telling you what they're concerned about. They're telling you how they came to their beliefs. And every time a gap opens up for you between what you know and what you want to know, wait, how did that happen? Or, gee, I wonder if they can give me an example. You offer those questions up. That person will continue to feel more and more heard. And you are trying to explore and discover more about them. And you take a break from defending your own view into going and exploring somebody else's. That's going to make them want to be so much more open with you.
Well, you hit the nail on the head, and so many viewers and listeners onto this program know the story of or a saying of the great Stephen Covey, who said, "Seek to understand before you are understood," and that's what the vaccine whisperer does, and what you're doing. And so it comes to mind. I'm just going to say, is compartmentalization then a virtue? So I know that if I meet you, Monica, or something, we won't talk about X. Is that a plus or a minus? So
that's a great question. I am reminded of the story of a woman named Courtney, who herself is very purple politically. Her father is very conservative. And they had gotten to a place where they decided, well, this is just getting too hard. Let's not talk about politics. But Courtney realized that there are some issues that for her are so important and form even a part of her identity, that she realized that if she could not talk with her father about these things, basically her father couldn't know her. And that meant that there was too much distance. So I know there's a lot of families and a lot of people who just say, you know what, let's just not touch these issues.
Sure.
What you risk is that then you fail to know and see each other, which is going to potentially, depending on how important these things are to you, going to kind of erode your relationship bit by bit. So people think that the answer is just not to talk about these things. And it can be just, let's take a break from it. Let's come back another time. Sure. But if it matters to people, then not talking about things means you're not seeing them.
Right. And you hit something very curious, and that's the idea of you don't know the whole me. And I know this is in a work environment, particularly with people of different ethnicities or different colors. We white people are real good at understanding black people, which means we have no idea what it means to be black or Hispanic in a white-dominated business culture. Cognitively, of course we do, but we don't know the feelings of it. And so emphasis of this whole person is so critical. Do you have a comment on that,
Yeah,
Monica?
I mean, you touched on experience. Experience is so important. So we can grasp, rationally, read a thought piece about someone else's experience. Wrong. That's wrong. Well, this is what I believe, But watch what happens when somebody begins to tell a story. Well, here's what happened to me, and this is what this felt like, to get pulled over by that police officer that one time. And right, when you hear that story, you can put yourself in there, you can paint the picture in your mind, and it's a whole different level of understanding.
You're absolutely correct. I have a colleague who told me when George Floyd happened, he said, I could have been George Floyd. And he told me a story and it, that kind of thing. And I never would have thought that. And so, yes, storytelling is important. And that's something that we in the communication field, you're working in, you are a journalist. You tell stories all the time. And that is such an effective, putting yourself in those shoes and radiate and, echoing. And that's why, getting back to your book, I never thought of it that way, is filled with stories, and you evoke, they're poignant. And there's joy there, but there's a poignancy and there's a sadness to it that leads to an awakening. So thank you for doing that. So it's great.
Yeah. Stories work. Stories communicate what logic can't,
Yeah. Well, yes, exactly. And something like music, if you will. So music is what communicates the emotions that words cannot. And poetry, yes, words, but in a different form. So I'm glad, and stories fall into that category. So thank you. Your book has some action tips, which is relevant to any kind of difference of opinion, whether you're at a family situation or a business situation. So you have some action steps. So one of them is determining what kind of questions to ask. What do you mean by that, Monica?
Yeah, so there's a way to kind of run the questions that you want to ask through a bit of a checklist to make sure that it's going to be a curious question. We think that any question is curious. No, it is not. The only questions that are truly curious are those that are primarily driven to close the gap between what is known and what is not known. When we bake in assumptions or accusations or even our own opinions into a question, they're not curious questions. So the check is to make sure that they are curious, that they are truly answerable, right? Sometimes we ask people a question they couldn't possibly answer as a way of trying to disqualify them
Mhm.
from the conversation. They need to be
Yeah.
raw, which means they don't have an assumption baked in or an accusation. And then they need to be exploring instead of demanding. We often say, why tell me right now, but you still haven't answered this question. It's like, well, why do they have to answer that question for you right now? What if they don't even know yet or they need to think about it?
In other words, don't ask a question like a prosecuting attorney. It works in
Right.
court, but not in life.
Right.
So
We keep putting each other on trial. And
that's
that's not a
very
way to
good.
learn about each other very well. That's a way to get each other's defenses up and to get each other wanting to just echo talking points that they've heard from other places.
Now, you also have something, this is a favorite of mine because I've wrestled with this and coached around it and written about it. And it's the secret to negotiation, really, and that's finding common ground. So tell me, Monica, how the heck we do that?
Mm-hmm. Well, part of it goes back to listening.
Yeah.
There actually is a lot of agreement on the way to people's conclusions. So even if somebody has a conclusion that you find just complete baloney, right? The path that they took to that conclusion, the experiences and values that inform them, you will relate to. It's going to happen. So part of what you can do in a conversation is just acknowledge where that agreement exists. I can see that. That's a fair point. Yeah, I gotta say, freedom also matters to me. Anytime that you state that in a conversation, it's like building a base camp up a mountain. The two of you can kind of breathe a little bit, acclimate, and climb higher.
I love that. What a wonderful metaphor. That's wonderful. Now, this is all great and it makes sense and everything's copacetic here. But of course, we're human beings. And if you're like me, and I'm sure you're not, you may flare up. You might get tense.
Mm.
So, what happens how can we guard against that or how do we deal with that,
Right.
Monica?
I think
So,
the better question is how we deal with it, because oftentimes we think that anytime there's too much of a powerful or even negative emotion in a conversation, the conversation is toast and we need to hit abort. But
mhm.
actually, I love this quote from author Valerie Kaur. She says, "Anger is a force that protects that which is loved." So anger, negative emotion, it's information, it's data, it's part of the content of a conversation. So one of the most powerful things that you can say if someone in a conversation is really flaring up and getting upset is to say something like, "Wow, I didn't realize how much this mattered to you." And then ask
That
another question.
Yeah, and that's a great way. And I know we live in an age of not just misinformation, but disinformation, and sadly, conspiracies. And one of the things, and I know you know this, why do conspiracies take hold, Monica? What have you researched this? So,
I've seen the research and I think a lot of it makes sense, but I think that there is a danger in assuming that that research that has been done explains every single person who feels drawn to a conspiracy theory. Um,
mhm.
I think it is still the most important thing if anyone in your life believes something that is in that category to actually approach them as them, not as a statistic, not as I know exactly. I read this wonderful research study about people like you.
Yeah.
Don't do that. Really,
Yeah.
because that is a way that we don't see each other, as when we choose to believe research and that explains, but I kind of ask like, "Oh, what research would explain you to me? What research would explain me to someone else?"
Yeah.
No research would explain me to someone else.
You hit a
You
nail on
know?
the head because what you're doing when you do that, not you, but the person who throws the research at it, it's in this kind of situation, you're objectifying.
Right.
And so one anecdotal thing I've come across with conspiracy people is it gives a sense of belonging.
Right.
And so there's something, and why would one believe in something that is contrary to common sense?
Mm.
But it gives them hope or something in their lives. Have you just seen that,
Yeah,
Monica?
I mean, I see that all over.
Yeah.
We all need to belong, and
Yeah.
when people's concerns, when it's just really hard for them to find any purchase in the relationships that they have or
Mhm.
in the narratives that surround them, when something just feels like it's just off and I don't get it, and then you hop online or you find a community where somebody seems to finally be speaking to something that you've been worried about, and here's their narrative. And maybe it doesn't make sense, like, according to everyone around you, no, that's baloney. But to you, man, you've spent a lot of time thinking about this and you can
Mhm.
see just how it might work. And so people do, really smart people find their way to these things if, if they feel pulled in. And the thing that I gravitate toward is the sense of belonging and also the sense of unheard concerns. And I'm worried about that.
Yeah, no, and I think that's important. And there's another thing, not everyone, but those who gravitate to the really outlandish conspiracies are suffering a degree of pain. And so I'm wondering if in a conversation, if you can say, I understand the pain you're feeling. Is that
Right.
being too personal or what?
No,
So,
I mean, I think that's great, only if it's genuine, of course.
yeah,
Anytime that this becomes too scripted, people see right through that.
yeah.
But yeah, it takes sitting with that pain and discomfort and hearing the stories and really putting yourself in that person's shoes, which won't be as hard as you might think it would be. Because I've been in those situations, and it's just not hard to empathize with someone who is telling you really truly how something feels and how much they struggle. It's a beautiful experience, the fact that we can connect with that.
And I'm going to go back to Father Boyle again, who I probably owe a lot of money to because I quote him all the time. But he does such wonderful work. In his book, Radical Kinship, he talks about it's about connectedness. And I think it's germane to these kinds of conversations. If, Monica, if I sense you and I sit down next to you and I'm going to tell you, Monica, here's the 3 things you need to do. Doom, 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 doom. Okay. Well, I don't know that you're going to listen. But second of all, how about that? I may likely turn you off. How about if I just sit down next to you and we maybe have a conversation and then we broach if a topic comes up and then say, would you like my perspective? Have you explored that, Monica?
Oh,
So,
absolutely. I think of it as, instead of talking, I think of it as sort of offering. You offer your perspective into a conversation, and others offer their own. And when you ask questions, what you're really doing is tugging at others, hoping that they will offer something of their own experience and their own perspective. And that's really just a way to look at a conversation that, again, is less adversarial and more about exploring. But yeah, I think that one of the best ways to introduce your own perspective after someone has shared theirs, you acknowledge what they've said. You even try to restate some of it so you can communicate that you really were listening and get it, and then you've told them, I hear you. And then you say, I'd like to, I look at it differently. For example, instead of saying I disagree is fine, but it can make people remember, oh, this is about agreement. Oh, right. Oh, well, gee, I better defend myself again. But instead, if you say, I look at that very differently, can I tell you about that?
yeah.
Oh,
I
sure.
love that. Yeah. And you're listening to you speak, you're such an affirmative person, but you're an affirmative listener. You have you ever considered executive coaching?
I don't know. That sounds
uh,
kind of fun.
no, seriously, you have. It's exactly the kinds of things. Tell me about what's going on. But when we're seeking people close to us or friends or whatever, it's fraught with all kinds of tension. And so I think what you've given us is some ideas to take the temperature down. So that's what's very important. So let's talk about, you talk about family situations, but what about work situations in the sense of when we have someone in our group, our work space who holds radically different ideas than we do. So any techniques, any ideas you have for broaching that divide, or should we go there?
Yeah, I mean, I come back to this idea that First of all, certainty is the arch villain of curiosity. So once someone in the workplace environment goes, I know what the right thing is, and that person who disagrees is just against me, right?
Mhm.
Instead of being curious and saying, oh, that person who disagrees, well, let me see how their ideas can make these ideas stronger. Let me go and figure it out. So it's again that tactic of put it on the table, ask people what their concerns are, ask people, have conversations about values instead of the issue itself. And keep in mind that when you do become too suspicious, too fearful, you will become less creative. You will. And your work will be worse. It will. So, yeah. So disagreements that you have to contend with at work. In fact, I think that the workplace is actually a wonderful case study for the political space and all these other places because at work, man, there's money to be made and money to be lost if we can't have productive disagreement that lead us to better results. Um,
It's interesting. The political divide, the dirty, dark secret of that is money. Each side is vested in division, whereas you
right.
just hit the nail on the head. The polarity in business is not positive. So,
Yeah.
so that's a good thought. So we have a question from Joe, who's a all the time listener, and he has a question. He said, "What does Monica think the number one quality to build bridges of understanding is?" Do you have a thought on that, Monica?
Yeah, I mean, well, the book is all about curiosity, so I have to say it again and kind of give credit to curiosity. People think of curiosity as a personality trait. This person is naturally curious, that person is not. But it's not. It's a practice. Any of us can do it. We're all capable of it. It starts with just noticing those gaps in our understanding and being aware of them long enough to go and ask our questions and fill it in. So it's curiosity is really, really important. Empathy is a nice kind of neighbor, sort of sister to curiosity. But curiosity without empathy can be voyeuristic. And empathy without curiosity, I mean, can be just sort of me, and go team.
That's great. Well, sadly, we are coming close to the end of our program. And as you know, I ask every guest a story about grace. Do you have a comment on grace that you would like to share, Monica?
Yeah, I mean, you said something earlier that reminded me of Daryl Davis. I don't know if you've heard of Daryl, but he is a blues musician, a black man, who asked this radical question. And he said, how can you hate me if you don't even know me? And he decided to ask that question of members of the Ku Klux Klan. And he now has this collection of like 200 of their robes that they gave him because they left that ideology. And it was like his is a really famous story and very inspiring to a lot of people, but it was the grace to be able to approach someone who has wrapped themselves literally is wearing the cloak of hate of an entire group. But Daryl did kind of have the grace to be like, but somewhere underneath that cloak is a human being.
Right.
And that human being cannot possibly hate me because they don't know
Right.
me. So I'm going to go talk to him.
That is, I do know that story now, but and what is so germane to that is it's such the human quality of it. And I like the way you integrated grace into it. What is so difficult in some of our world that we are taught to hate, not maybe, well, sometimes explicitly, but because we don't know someone, we just objectify them. And when I objectify an individual, I can do anything. I can be contempt, and that's the anti-human thing. But once I know, someone, then then I know their heart. I begin to know their heart. Mm-hmm. Oh, they're just like me in some ways,
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
you
got to stay open.
And I love the way you wrap this into, and I would say an attribute of grace might be curiosity too. So
yeah, for sure.
So, Monica, how can people find you?
If you go to reclaimcuriosity.com, that's the movement here, you'll find information about my book and where to find me on social media at Monica Guzman on Twitter and Instagram.
Great. We'll put that in the notes, and it has been such a pleasure. And again, the name of the book is I Never Thought of It That Way. Thank you, Moni. You've been just a terrific guest, and I hope this book becomes a mega seller because, boy, do we need it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John.